they all talked about good and bad bacteria. And loads of academics miss out on understanding because they so focus on their tiny little narrow field. The reintroduction of the wolves to Yellowstone Park was a really good example to show why good and bad bacteria is so wrong, and it's a myth.
Sam and Kit Bowen-Russell, who really took skincare into their own hands.
Twin brothers from the UK who are taking the skincare industry by storm.
Sam is a nuclear astrophysicist, and Kit is a geophysicist and author.
A Notre Dame grad and his twin brother are looking to revolutionize skin health.
The two launched a 2-year intensive research study.
Two very smart guys who knew all about bad skin at a very early age.
That woman at the end was our mum, and really she's the face which launched 1,000 questions for us.
Yeah, I was thinking back the other day when, for everything that's, well, not started this because we were well deep into it, but all of the thinking that we do. I remember when you always used the analogies of Yellowstone Park to talk about skin, and everyone else would, and even now is like, what? Skin? How does acne relate to Yellowstone Park? How does I want to get rid of my acne or my eczema? How does that? What are you talking about? Yellowstone Park. And it is amazing analogies about these systems and all of our physics brains and our deep understanding of physics that really sort of helped us form this view on the skin.
Yeah, I think that's why we've had all of the success which we have had, is because the ability of us in our research to take inspiration from loads of different areas and to use them all on the skin microbiome and the skin. So things like, as we talked about, Yellowstone Park, physics, deep physics principles, which you studied a lot of at university. Obviously I did as well when I was there, but not in quite as much depth as you. So yeah, I would say you're an expert on it. But then bringing all of these things together is why loads of academics and loads of people just miss out discoveries in general and miss out on understanding because they so focus on their tiny little narrow field of research or narrow field they're focusing on. Did you?
Yeah, well, there's the narrowness, but then also the understanding which thing is the base. So you've got the narrowness, and yeah, people don't want to go out even in related fields, but then you've got the base. So most people researching ecosystems and the microbiome, they haven't got nearly everyone, apart from us, hasn't got a physics background. So, but then all of these ecosystems, what are they based on? They're based on nonlinear physics and entropy. So you need to, the base requirement is like on a CV when you apply for a job, the base requirement, like having, I don't know, having passed your 10 GCSEs at school or whatever it is for your job, the base requirement should be understand nonlinear physics and entropy. And if you don't do that, then you can't research. You can't research this because otherwise your thinking will be totally wrong. And as we've seen, lo and behold, it is, because everyone's just focusing about one microbe in the microbiome and how we can control as humans this system that has trillions of parts. But no, we definitely can control it by putting in this number of microbes to the system when we cannot control it or know any of the details like that. But exactly. I love those memories, and I wanted to talk about those.
Definitely, yeah. I think again we've gone off into loads of different areas there, gone off into loads of different tributaries down the river. So yeah, one myth which stood out. Firstly, there's loads of myths which people make mistakes about within loads of different fields. Well, especially in the skin microbiome field. There's one really in the skin microbiome and the microbiome in general field which stands out, and that's the myth that there are good and bad bacteria. So I remember, you know this one. This is one of the biggest ones we always rail against, because the idea that they're inherently good and bad bacteria just totally misunderstands the whole ecosystem, doesn't it? And I remember, I think you were there with me in, was it San Francisco, the conference?
Yeah, San Francisco. biodiversity, I think.
Yeah. So that was the day before you took too much of a space cookie and just got very paranoid. But we were invited to talk at a world-leading conference on the skin microbiome in San Francisco. And I remember us looking at all the presentations, and they all talked about good and bad bacteria. And there were people using this as if it was written in science. You had top scientific researchers from Yale, Harvard, UPenn, all of these top ones in America. And they all believed this myth that microbes can be good or microbes can be bad. And again,
well, I would say this is again a general point, but it's one of the. It's not just it's open for debate. It's just like no, that's it. And so when we go up and we talk, they just say, oh no, I don't believe that it's biodiversity. And I said, okay, so we can prove that it's biodiversity, and the only way that you can understand it and prove it is through physics. So
hold on. That in our heads, I mean, if I was a normal viewer, we were just talking about good and bad and bacteria, and then you started talking about biodiversity. Where on earth does that come from? So hold on, we're going to slow down. Yeah. Sorry.
Well, the conference was called biodiversity. So.
Yeah. But anyway, that at the moment that just confuses things, clouds things. So what you're talking about is the idea that it's more important to look at the ecosystem as a whole being healthy than pick on individual good or bad bacteria. But let's go back to the idea of good and bad bacteria, first of all, because I think that's really important and where they got it from. Now, I was sitting there and I was remembering these adverts on TV as a youngster for Danone and Actimel, I think it was, or maybe it's Actimel are owned by Danone. Anyway, they always talked about nourishing your good bacteria. And obviously this is a really nice way of explaining it to consumers and normal people, because before that they probably thought that all bacteria was bad. So to say your good bacteria, again, is just a really good way of explaining to them, actually, the bacteria in and on you are really good for you, most of them. But then when I started thinking about it, when we were doing all of our world-leading research, and I was sitting at that conference, I'd been reading up in the weeks previously about different ecosystems, and one example really stuck out. I think you know what I'm going to say, don't you?
Yeah, I would just say it's not the weeks previously. You'd already aired the whole paper that this was published in. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, sorry. No, we'd already put it in our peer-reviewed and published research years before. But I was just revisiting the topic. The wolves, the reintroduction of the wolves to Yellowstone Park, was a really good example to show why the idea that good and bad bacteria is so wrong, and it's a myth. And I know to people that might seem crazy, but all we're doing is looking at ecosystems. And the example of the reintroduction of the wolves to Yellowstone Park is one that I've used in countless talks across the world, and we've used in our peer-reviewed and published research as well to prove this exact point, and many other points as well. But the reason this captured my imagination was because the story of it is so amazing, first of all. So the wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone Park after they died out years previously, and it totally transformed the park in many ways that the rangers hadn't even contemplated before. So rivers changed direction, things like this. Things which you thought would be totally unrelated to reintroducing one species to the ecosystem. Anyway, that's a story for another time. We can do whole podcasts on that. But within that story was proof that within an ecosystem, organisms aren't inherently good or bad. So we're just using Yellowstone Park as an analogy for the skin. Just another ecosystem, same things, same principles apply. And I remember when I did all of my research and we did our research, you know which animal I'm going to talk about now, don't you?
I think so.
The elk. So what happened was when the park lost its wolves, they noticed loads of things slowly, but then much quicker as time went on, start to happen, which actually really damaged the park. So one of the apex predators, the wolves were taken out and they died out in the park. And just focusing on one species, the elk, what they noticed was the elk numbers, because they had no natural predators to keep their numbers in tow, they massively swelled, they massively grew. And then also the elk, as a result, started totally overgrazing the park and also grazing in areas which they wouldn't have before, which again had knock-on domino effects to the whole ecosystem. But what happened was when the wolves were reintroduced to the park, the elk stopped behaving in a damaging way to the ecosystem. And they were just elk again. They didn't overgraze, they didn't graze in areas they shouldn't, and they didn't have this catastrophic domino effect to the whole ecosystem. So that just shows the elk aren't inherently good or bad, but under certain situations when the park's health is damaged, for example, when the wolves are taken out, the elk start behaving in a damaging way. So that would be in a bad way. So scientists on the skin would look at that and they would say, well, the elk are bad. But then when the wolves were reintroduced and the elk were actually contributing to the ecosystem, the scientists, again, would look at the same species and they would say they are good.
Yeah.
It just shows you that on the skin, this idea of good and bad is so wrong and is such a myth.
So in the microbiome in general, good and bad, you can go from good to bad. So the elk were bad, then after the reintroduction of the wolves, they suddenly turned to good, and they're a vital part of it. Because imagine if you suddenly took the elk out, then loads of the things that they did that were upkeeping the park then would go awry and something else bad would happen. So they were needed in the park. So saying it's good and bad is a total misnomer, if that's the word. And I know why people do it. It's for marketing. I understand that. To explain it in a good way, that's good. But academics use this all the time.
Exactly, yeah. And that's the worrying thing, isn't it? When myths like this, which are, again, used and they actually harm science because people get the wrong understanding of how ecosystems and the skin works. And then as a result, the wrong solutions are used, trying to replace good bacteria, thinking that they'll always be good. Instead of thinking, actually, what we need to do is we need to make the conditions right so that the whole ecosystem is healthy, so that we get back to that image. And I'm thinking of these helicopter shots over Yellowstone Park now, and it looks beautiful and gorgeous. But what they were saying was when the wolves died out, it became some of the most overgrazed, I think, grasslands in the Western world. That was how bad it was, just by that one apex predator dying out. So I'm just imagining now what we need to do, instead of focusing on one species, is to zoom out, have that helicopter shot going over the Yellowstone Park, the luscious ecosystem. And the same is true, we always use the analogy of the Amazon rainforest.